Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. And this is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers what used to be known as the global war on terror and what we call the Long War. Today, we're going to do something different and take a look at the war in Ukraine. Joining us today is John Hardy. He's the deputy director of FDD's Russia program. The Long War Journal is going to be expanding its coverage to include Russia, and John will be taking the lead. In the near future, we'll be issuing written reports on the fighting in Ukraine and anything else related to Russia and its military operations. John, welcome to Generation Jihad.
Hey, Bill. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, John, I really look forward to working with you on this project. It's been something we've been discussing for a while, and I think I'm really glad to get started on this. So today we're going to examine the current state of the fighting in Ukraine. We're going to start off take a look at the tactical theater level of the fighting, and then we'll end the podcast with the look at the strategic issues related to the fight in Ukraine. Obviously the big story right now in Ukraine is Ukraine's stunning counteroffensive in Kharkiv Oblast. Well, before we even get into the details of that, this really went under everyone's radar. Everybody was focusing on Kherson. What happened here? How did this all develop?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, Bill. I think to understand the context, you really have to go back to that Kherson Oblast offensive that you mentioned and Russia's attempt to preempt it. So in the months before the Kharkiv Oblast counteroffensive, Russia redeployed a substantial amount of forces that they had in the east towards the south. This is the Zaporizhia direction, as well as towards the western bank of the Dnieper River. So a lot of the eastern military district forces Russia had near Izum in Kharkiv Oblast were redeployed there, leaving Russian lines in Kharkiv really thinly manned. This left Russia very vulnerable. There were Russian telegram channels warning that Russia's position there was vulnerable and that Ukraine was conducting a buildup in preparation for a potential counteroffensive. But fortunately for Russia, they sort of, the command didn't really deploy reinforcements in time. So by the time Ukraine launched the counteroffensive, the front line was just very thinly manned and the front line broke very quickly.
So do you think the Russians were aware that this was developing and were too slow in redeploying or in getting its reinforcements to the area, or were they just caught off guard?
Well, so I think they're definitely too slow. Whether they had a good idea maybe a week ahead of time, that's possible. But it takes a substantial amount of time for Russia to redeploy forces on exterior lines from the south back up to the east. So even if they did have a week or so, few days of heads up, that really wouldn't be enough time. And Russian military bloggers on these telegram channels have been warning of a buildup there for maybe a few weeks. So if the Russian general staff had been paying attention then, it could have been possible to head it off. But for whatever reason, they didn't decide to do so. It's really hard for me to say from my vantage point whether they just didn't know or whether they were just complacent and about the threat.
Now, what was the Ukrainian military doing in the lead up to this offensive in the Kharkiv area? Were they shaping the battlefield, redeploying forces? I'm still a little bit stunned that the Ukrainians were able to deploy such a large number of forces and the Russians just weren't capable of countering this. But yeah, talk to us a little bit about how the Ukrainians shaped the battlefield for this operation.
Sure. So yeah, in the weeks ahead of the Kharkiv Oblast counteroffensive, Ukraine did conduct some shaping operations targeting the Russian rear, things like C2 nodes, ammo depots, fuel depots, things of that nature, essentially laying the ground for the counteroffensive. And as I mentioned earlier, there was a substantial buildup there. I think the ultimate force for the counteroffensive was around 4 to 5 brigades, and in addition to SOF and things like that. So there was a substantial force that flowed there, as well as south of Izum. So And just quickly read, listeners, if you don't have a map in front of you, I would suggest pulling up a map real quick. This will be a sort of a geography heavy podcast. But
and if you're driving, don't pull up a map. Just listen to us.
So south of Izum, basically, if you're looking at the map, Izum is a key Russian headquarters and logistics hub for the push towards Levant. And then Kupiansk, which is north of Izum, is sort of the logistic hub that feeds that, right? So basically what Ukraine was doing was attacking the western flank of that sort of spear going at Slavyansk.
And when did the actual breakthrough here occur? Talk to us a little bit, you could go into a little bit of detail of when did we actually see that this was developing and that the Ukrainians were able to break through? Right.
So from what it looks like, Ukraine massed some armor, maybe about 15 tanks or so for an initial breakthrough force. They broke through on September 6th in a suburb northwest of Balaklia, and then rapidly sort of exploited those gains. Like I mentioned, the front line there was very weak, manned primarily by mobilized separatist forces, very low morale, very poorly trained and equipped. And then there was also a couple of Rosgvardia units, Russia's National Guard, manning the second line. Again, these units are really not trained or equipped for heavy combat. They have low interoperability with their Russian artillery support, which reportedly was a problem. There are also some forces from Russia's Western Military District, maybe even parts of the 8th Combined Arms Army, part of the Southern Military District in the area. But overall, a very thinly manned area for Russia, a bit surprisingly so, considering how critical that northwestern flank was to the Izum axis.
So it seems to me that what the Russians' plan here was that they basically put up a tripwire with poorly trained, poorly manned tripwire. They felt that they could have rushed reinforcements in when needed, very likely rely on artillery, air, etc., to suppress a Ukrainian advance. Would you disagree with that?
So I don't know if I'd say a tripwire. I'd say overall, across the battlefield, Russia has a severe manpower problem. And we might touch on this later. But just quickly now, I think they're running into a situation where they just don't have enough forces, especially well-trained and equipped forces, to spread across the entire battlefield. So, of course, we saw them flow forces to the south. Really across the battlefield, they've had to rely on LDNR separatist forces, Wagner, a paramilitary group, other forces like that to man the front lines, lead assaults while they try to preserve their heavily degraded regular units. So I think this is a problem Russia kind of encounters across the battlefield, and this is where they left this area particularly
lightly manned. So, and I'm going to jump to a bigger issue here because I think this is a good point to bring it up. Putin has described his war in Ukraine as a special military operation. I think one of the biggest problems that we've seen here is an unwillingness to treat this as an actual war. This is fortunate for the Ukrainians, in my opinion. He hasn't called up reserves. He hasn't conducted a draft. He hasn't committed the number of forces needed to fight on multiple theaters, on multiple fronts in this operation. And I think this is really, causing, I think we have two things here. The unwillingness to properly resource, Putin's unwillingness to properly resource this war, and this idea that it would be a cakewalk for him. Would you agree or disagree with that assessment?
No, I definitely agree. What he thought this war would be going in is obviously very different from how it turned out. It's somewhat a banal point at this juncture, but what's still remarkable is that he, is just not willing to treat this as a true war. Many within the Russian security commentariats have been complaining of this for months. He still wants to treat it as a so-called special military operation, which precludes him from tapping additional sort of forms of manpower, conscripts, maybe even a partial mobilization, which could allow Russia to continue this war more effectively. Russia's been sort of trying to rely on these piecemeal efforts, recruiting volunteer battalions, Wagner, LDNR forces, etc. But eventually, you sort of run out of additional people you can tap in those ways, and actually you might end up degrading your ability to take more drastic measures like introducing conscripts, doing a partial mobilization, precisely because the Russian regular forces that would be used to sort of form those volunteer battalions are the same forces that you need to train conscripts, train mobilized personnel. So I think Putin, by trying to muddle through, is actually constricting his future options.
All right, John. So over the summer, the Russians did have some progress in Luhansk. They were hitting the Ukrainians hard. Ukrainians took significant casualties in Luhansk province, and the Russians advanced through several cities. How does the Kharkiv offensive impact any gains the Russians may have had, or do you think the Russians can proceed from here, or are there gains that they had over the summer under threat?
Sure. So I think first it's important to put in perspective the relative gains. So what Ukraine has gained over the past few days has far exceeded what Russia gained over those many months. And I think more important, at least during the second phase over the summer, more important than the towns or villages taken were the relative losses on both sides. And Ukraine, as you mentioned, took some very heavy losses. You might remember news reports, Ukrainian officials during that time, talking about those losses very openly. But Russia also took heavy losses as well. And I think ultimately what was important is Ukraine was able to weather it, and they have an overall manpower advantage compared to Russia because they've mobilized their entire society. They have lots of untapped mobilized manpower. Not all of it is very well trained, but the UK and others are trying to work on that. But so they have this manpower advantage, and so in this war of attrition, they basically emerged in a better position, taking in Western military equipment to equip additional units, and emerged from the second phase, I think, overall in a better position. They could start to capitalize on Russia's increasing manpower problem.
How did this operation impact Russia's ability to take the Slovyansk and Kramatorsk? These are two key cities that Russia needs to conquer the Donbass. And I would rate this as being the Russians' ability to take these cities as being slim to none at this point. What are your thoughts?
No, I definitely agree. I think they would have had a tough time doing it even before the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and now they definitely will. And actually, as you alluded to, Ukraine, what they're able to accomplish is actually put them in a position to threaten the Russian positions in Luhansk out of the gains that Russia paid so much for during the summer. So Ukraine was able to cross the river and it's pushing towards Liman, and will probably push towards Crimea as well, which is a key city, a key town near Severodonetsk. So Russia is definitely under threat in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's this is a stunning and a major victory for the Ukrainians. What happened here. We'll get more into the bigger picture later on and what the impact this is for support from the West, which I think is a key issue, particularly as we go into the winter. But we'll talk about that a little later. All right, let's pivot now to the Kherson offensive. Tell us, first of all, what's the strategic importance of Kherson for both Russia and Ukraine?
Sure. So, as listeners probably know, this was Kherson City was taken very early on in the war. It's the capital of that region. It's got great economic importance due to its geographic position, as well as obviously political significance for the reason I just described. And militarily, it's sort of the gateway to Mykolaiv and Odessa. So Russia, frankly, doesn't have much of a chance of taking either of those cities as we stand, but taking back Kherson would sort of put the nail in the coffin.
The Ukrainian military has been telegraphing the Kherson offensive for months. A lot of deployments. I think we've seen a lot of the U.S. weapons and Western weapons being deployed in this region. When did the Kherson offensive officially begin, and what has been the impact of that operation so far?
Sure. So, as listeners probably know, the Ukrainian military officially announced it on the 29th. Might have begun slightly before that, but essentially that's when it kicked off officially in terms of ground. But Ukraine, of course, had been conducting extensive shaping operations in the weeks and months before that, especially targeting a few key bridges that Russia used, the Dnieper and Hulits rivers. So Ukraine is essentially trying to degrade Russia's ability to supply its troops there and sort of weaken them to the point where they eventually have to have no choice but to abandon that untenable position. I think Ukraine's really goal here is not necessarily a destructive urban battle to take Kherson city, but to sort of split that Russian grouping on the western bank and eventually leave the Russian command with the choice of either taking mass losses or retreating across the river.
The bridges over the rivers to Kherson. This is extremely important for, as you mentioned, for the Russians to resupply and to reinforce their forces across the river. Tell us a little bit of how the Ukrainians have attacked these bridges and what the Russians have been doing in order to counter this.
Well, so as listeners know, the U.S. and its allies have transferred HIMARS, MLRS systems to Ukraine that Ukrainians have been using extensively to target these bridges, very precise systems, longer range than Ukraine's own rocket artillery systems. So Ukraine has been using these systems with great effect to degrade these bridges. They're either inoperable or very, very close to it. For a while, the Russians and Ukrainians sort of played a game of strike the bridge, repair it, and repeat the cycle. I think at least on one of the bridges, the Russians are still trying to repair a little bit. Maybe there's some very, very small volume going across it, but essentially these are mostly knocked out for the Russians, which, again, like I said, the Ukrainians hope will eventually squeeze Russian logistics to the point that they're forced to abandon their position.
And the Ukrainian military has been targeting Russian air defenses. Talk a little bit about that. How effective has the Ukrainian military being in suppressing Ukrainian air defense systems?
Right. So in part using HARM missiles supplied by the United States, the Ukrainians are trying to degrade Russian air defense coverage and in turn free up Ukraine's own manned and unmanned aircraft, the latter being especially the TB2 drones from Turkey. So it seems like they've been at least somewhat successful in that effort. Ukraine does seem to be conducting these for a relatively high air up tempo. Again, for the Ukrainians, considering the limited number of aircraft they have available, it does seem like they've focused their air resources in that area.
Talk about there's three main axes in this fight in Kherson. Talk a little bit about that. What are the areas and where have the Ukrainians had the most success?
Sure. So the main one is basically a bridgehead near Druzhko, Lazov kind of area over the Hulits River. This is again the main sort of push. The others are being up in the north, coming from the direction of Rig, and the other being towards the left, coming from Mykolaiv. In the central axis is where the Ukrainians have had the most success, maybe pushing, I think the Ukrainian Southern Command spokesperson said tens of kilometers. I think that's about right. Expanding the bridgehead somewhat, fairly modest gains, but this will probably be a fight that plays out over the coming weeks and months rather than a lightning counteroffensive like the one in Kharkiv.
Yeah, it seems the Russians are, obviously redeploying forces from the Kharkiv region has helped the Russians stabilize this front somewhat. So how would you overall describe the Ukrainian gains in this area? What would your assessment be of this operation in general for them at the moment?
It's modest gains, but again, because of the like you said, the Russian force availability there. And I think the Ukrainians probably anticipated that. I think, which is probably why they're taking the approach they are. But again, the hope is that by splitting this Russian grouping, you can sort of cut off a large portion of Russian forces and eventually force them to abandon their positions there.
Yeah, one thing I think we've seen with both Kiev and Kharkiv is that once the Russians realize that they've lost in an area, that they're not going to have, I think what the Ukrainians are doing here in Kherson, if it can be effective, is that the Russians just seem to abandon these positions. They have no concerns about just fully abandoning these positions, and it's so I think what the Ukrainians are doing here can have effect, if assuming that they can have success in this operation.
Right. Yeah, I think the Russian command would rather do that than take mass losses. But of course, I think they'll try to hang on by their fingernails while they can.
I've heard reports that the Ukrainians were taking significant losses during the Kherson offensive. Do we have any information on the losses of both the Ukrainians and the Russians? I've seen reports that the Ukrainians took some significant losses in armor, particularly. And what are you seeing on this? This is one of the most frustrating things I think covering this war, is trying to get good information. Both sides are playing a very effective game of concealing information. What is your take? What does your gut tell you about how both the Russians and Ukrainians have fared, casualty wise and things like losing of armor and significant equipment?
I'd say the Ukrainians have taken some losses. It's definitely not as much as the Russian Ministry of Defense likes to say. It's press releases, but it's significant. I think there was a Washington Post report that's particularly revealing about some of the losses, and I think what it shows is these are not debilitating, but they are significant. And I think they show that Kherson, despite the claims of some folks and even some Ukrainians officials, I don't think Kherson was sort of a diversion or deception, at least in the Ukrainian general staff planning. I think this is a well-resourced counteroffensive. As is the one in Kharkiv Oblast, and the difference in outcome is really down to where Russia decided to allocate its forces.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, John. I have seen reports. Was Kherson a feint? It allowed them. I think more so that the Ukrainians just capitalized on the Russian weakness in Kharkiv in order to launch. It exploited an opportunity. Just tell me what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I think the Ukrainian defense minister said as much.
Let's talk about what's been happening outside of Kherson and Kharkiv. Any other areas of the battlefield that you want to discuss?
So we already briefly discussed the other parts of Luhansk Oblast where Russian positions now under threat. So I think no need to recover that. But essentially elsewhere, it's mostly a stagnant battlefield. We've seen some both before and after the Kherson counteroffensive, we saw some sort of localized Ukrainian counterattacks in the Donbass, in the Zaporizhia and Vuhledar areas. And I think we may see some more activity in the latter two in the weeks ahead. There are reports on both sides that both sides are building up their forces there. So we may see, again, some sort of movement on those fronts, but it's just a little bit too early to say. In terms of the Donbass, it's really mostly been stagnant. The Russians are still trying to push towards Bakhmut, but front lines there really haven't moved in weeks.
All right, let's move on to the big picture here. I think the key question here is who can sustain the fight. I think Russia's key constraint is manpower. Ukraine seems to be weaponry, particularly Western supplied weaponry. The Ukrainians are going to have to rely more on Western weaponry, as it's depleting its old Soviet stockpiles. Where do you think the trend, lies here? Is it in the favor of the Ukrainians? Is it in the favor of the Russians?
So I see the correlation of forces going in Ukraine's favor. I think this has been the case for some time now. It's starting to really come to a head. I think we'll probably continue going that way. especially as Russia, as I mentioned earlier, runs into some more problems with these piecemeal manpower generation solutions. And actually, a lot of the volunteer troops that Russia was able to recruit for lucrative short-term contracts earlier in the war, well, those contracts, many of them may be running out soon. So there's a question of retention. Do these guys want to continue in this hard slugfest of a war, or do they want to sort of take their money and go back to Russia? I suspect many of them will choose the latter. And among the regular forces, many of them are not willing to come back. If they do get a short rotation out of the battlefield, often they want to stay there. And so there's been lots and lots of reports, probably even thousands of regular Russian troops refusing to continue fighting. And I suspect that as the Russian military gets increasingly exhausted, that number will climb.
Can Russia turn that around? Do they have the capability of, if Putin called up a draft, or if they mobilized reserves or redeployed forces from other, from the east, say, do you think the Russians could turn that issue around?
So I think Putin has options. We discussed them a little bit already. Tapping the pool of conscript manpower, potentially some sort of partial mobilization. The Russian military is not the Soviet military. It's not a mass mobilization army, but there's some capacity for slow intake of some mobilized personnel. But really, I think the first go-to would be conscripts. But Putin does not really seem at all inclined to go that route. Like we already discussed, he's opted for piecemeal solutions that actually degrade his ability to go that route. And even now, there are some members of the Duma calling for, hey, let's call a spade a spade. This is a war. Stop calling it a special military operation. Let's really go all into this thing. And the Kremlin is still saying, hey, mobilization is table at this point. So I think Putin probably fears domestic stability risks if he were to go that route, which is why he's done everything in his power to avoid it.
And what are the Ukrainian advantages with manpower here? Talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So, as I said earlier, Ukraine has really mobilized its whole society, and it's, on paper, they say a 1 million man army. Obviously, it's not really that big, but they do have a lot of mobilized personnel. Again, much of it untrained. There's a program in the UK that's trying to, train up, at least a few thousand so far of these forces, maybe tens of thousands more in the months ahead. But Ukraine overall does have that manpower advantage, and they're able to equip additional brigades with Western kit. So, over time, as Russia's very sort of goes downhill, Ukraine is trying to sort of go the opposite direction.
Yeah, I think this is a key issue here. The Ukrainians are fighting for their country. They're motivated on the defense here, where Putin is not willing to call this what it is, which is a war, by calling it a special military operation. He can't seem to get the buy-in from, he's not committing all the resources and not having the motivation to fight. So I definitely think that over time, despite, issues, with the Ukrainians, both sides at this point, they're digging deep into the well. I go back to Afghanistan. The Afghan military certainly was better resourced with weapons, and it had a greater pool to recruit from, but it didn't have what the Taliban had, which was well-motivated fighters. And that ultimately, I think, was partially led to the defeat of the Afghan government. I think we're seeing a similar type situation here, where despite whatever problems the Ukrainians have, with, look, what was happening over the summer, they were pushing in raw recruits to man the lines and taking heavy casualties. I think that was having an effect. But something like, or this recent counteroffensive in Kharkiv, that does wonders in boosting the morale of those troops, knowing they made sacrifices in order to achieve, a strategic goal, which was to liberate the northeastern Ukraine. So talk a little bit about the training that the Ukrainians are receiving. I know the United Kingdom is providing it, and the U.S. Are any other European countries working to train Ukrainian personnel?
Yeah, a number of Scandinavian countries and others have signed on. I think it's maybe 8 or so European countries so far. But yeah, so the initial UK target was 10,000 troops over a few months, each batch getting a few weeks of basic training. Again, these are really fresh, mobilized personnel with no military experience. So just going over the basics, basic training. But so recently they've actually decided to expand the program slightly. I think probably with the influx of additional trainer capacity from these European countries, they can afford to do that. So from what I understand, the training cycles will go a little bit longer, 5 or so weeks, maybe get into some more unit training as opposed to just basic skills. And so hopefully that'll play dividends for Ukraine.
What's the type of training? Is this just basic infantry? Are they getting training on armor? Are they getting artillery, air defense, or is it a mix?
Right. So at least from the videos released on Ukrainian official Facebook sites, et cetera, at least up until now, it's looked like mostly basic. But I think with the extension, they should have a chance to go a little bit deeper.
Is the training occurring inside or outside of Ukraine?
It's in the UK.
It's in the UK.
Yeah.
So thousands of Ukrainians are being transported.
Have gone through so far. Yeah, I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but yeah, several thousand have gone through so far. And of course, there's other training efforts on particular systems like HIMARS. Everything else we provided, we train these Ukrainian troops, Germany and elsewhere. But this program specifically is for mobilized personnel to try to again help Ukraine tap all that manpower it has, that unskilled manpower, make it a little bit more skilled, and then use that advantage on the battlefield.
I assume the Ukrainians are conducting their own basic training inside Ukraine?
Oh yeah,
is that correct?
And there's been a lot more videos, at least especially in the past couple of months, maybe 2 months of, especially the territorial defense forces getting more training. I don't know if this is just a PR campaign, increased PR, or if there's actually more of a concerted training effort going on. It sort of seems like the latter. But again, this is just part and parcel of that effort to take all this unskilled manpower and make it more useful in the battlefield.
It's probably a combination of both, right? They are conducting more skilled training.
The Ukrainians sort of took some domestic flack during the summer months we've already discussed, and high casualty rates, especially among these territorial defense personnel, which often were sort of fighting on the front lines in a role they were not initially conceived for.
And have the Russians been making any effort to interdict the training, to launch strikes against the training bases and things of that nature? I think this is something that's somewhat surprised me over time, is that we seem to be seeing fewer and fewer deep penetration strikes inside, Western Ukraine, where, what's your take on
that? So if you remember back during the early months of the war, there was a strike on a training center in the West. I think there may have been one, maybe a couple more, one more maybe. But no, overall, I don't think this had a big impact on that front. I mean, in general, the Russian Air Force has not been very effective in this war. I think there are a few different reasons for that, but yeah, they haven't. They've been very, very reluctant to penetrate into Ukrainian air defense envelopes, and for that reason, they're not able to very effectively degrade things like ground lines of communication, key bridges. Like a lot of Russian Telegram channels are saying, "Why haven't we hit the bridges?" That's a great question, but you can, as the Ukrainians have showed, it takes a lot of high precision missiles to knock out a big bridge. And, the Russian missiles aren't nearly as accurate as Western ones. So because the VKS, the Air Space Force, is not able to, hit it with dumb bombs, getting close to it with dumb bombs, they just have not been very effective from the air.
Yeah, I agree. I've been, it's been stunning that the Russians look, and I know in some instances they have hit like train stations, railheads.
Yeah, they've hit bridges and stuff, which is overall not very effective.
But yeah, it hasn't been an effective campaign. I really think that, the Russians their air forces seem to be committed to localized attempts to establish local air superiority and air to ground, localized tactical air to ground strikes, things of that nature.
Yeah, and that's actually, you bring that up in the Kharkiv Oblast counteroffensive. Just from what I can tell, open source information is always imperfect, especially in the air domain. But it did seem, and in part based on Russian, Ukrainian accounts, like the VKS was being especially cautious, in part because Ukraine had moved up extra air defenses and really saturated the area. So I think that probably further degraded Russia's ability to use air power to staunch Ukrainian advances.
Yeah, this is where I think Western air defense systems have really helped the Ukrainians. They've really neutralized the Russian ability to use their air forces to have particularly have a strategic effect in this war. The Ukrainians seem to be able to operate behind the lines, redeploy its forces and conduct logistics, things of that nature, training, and take weapons in, stockpiles. This is really hurting the Russians in the long run, in the short term and the long term, in my opinion.
The Western systems of help, the German mobile short range systems, I think at least the Ukrainians say were useful in the Kharkiv counteroffensive. I think the biggest failure on that front was, in its initial suppression of enemy air defense campaign during the very opening phase of the war was just, nowhere near sufficient, and Ukraine was able to kind of move its air defenses out from under those strikes, and have since been very mobile and agile in the way they use them. So because Ukraine has those long and medium range systems, it forces the Russian pilots to fly very low, which in turn degrades situational awareness and precision. And then they're vulnerable to the man pads and the short range stuff.
And just to be clear, man pads are the man portable air defense systems. So let's turn to the issue for Ukraine, a key issue, Western military aid. Let's talk to us about the key issues related to Western military aid to Ukraine.
Yeah, so I think as our listeners know, Ukraine is very reliant on Western military aid at this point. As you mentioned earlier, they've largely exhausted their stocks of Soviet standard artillery rounds. So, they're very reliant on Western artillery. Same goes for, protected mobility, armor. There are many, many videos of Ukraine putting Western armor, especially to good effect in the Kharkiv counteroffensive. Same goes for the Kherson Oblast one as well. And really good combined arms, use of infantry and armor. But anyways, Ukraine is and will continue to be dependent on Western largesse.
So there's reports of U.S. and European stockpiles running low as the U.S. and Western countries are supplying the things, everything from the multiple launch rocket system and HIMARS rockets. We've seen reports that the U.S. this was months ago, where the U.S. had given a third of its Javelin anti-tank missiles, supplying a large number of artillery shells. What is your take on? Do you think this is a significant problem, or do you think this is a problem in the short term, the long term? Is this a problem that's overstated?
Yeah, so at least in my opinion, it's something to keep an eye on. I don't think it's a critical issue just yet. I don't think it will be, at least for the next, for the foreseeable future. There do seem, just based on public reporting, there do seem to be some issues with 155 millimeter U.S. stocks, 155 millimeter artillery shells. But I think, at least just based on my understanding, these problems the shortage is not critical. We're not getting down to a point where we'd say, oh, we got to cut the Ukrainians off. So I think, Western aid will continue to flow, and hopefully the counteroffensive success, Ukraine's counteroffensive success, will invigorate Western support. I think that was a big issue going into both of these counteroffensives was, well, if they don't go that well, will the West sort of say, all right, well, you had your shot. Unfortunately, you're not able to regain much territory, so it's time to come to some sort of settlement. I think Ukraine has clearly proven they're able to take Western aid and do a lot with it. So, hopefully that will continue to inspire further support.
How would you define the foreseeable future, John? I try to always look at things as short, medium, and long term. Short term for me is about a year, medium term 1 to 5 years, then obviously long term 5 and beyond, or maybe like 1 to 3 for medium term. What is your look on foreseeable future?
Yeah, I'm just really referring to the next few months. It's hard to say without knowing, U.S. stocks of artillery shells. It's classified, so I don't know that. But just, based on my understanding, is we're not, at a critical point. For the Europeans, I have less visibility into their stocks, but of course, the U.S. is the big benefactor, is the big supporter here. What the Europeans provide is important, but really it comes down to support.
Yeah, one of my big concerns, and so I think I am more concerned about this than you, but I think you're right in your time frame, next several months. Yeah, absolutely, this is something we could deal with. I'm looking at this more from probably the 6 months to 1 year. I start to worry about this. One of my concerns is we are depleting stockpiles and we're not replacing them quick enough. So as we're depleting our stockpiles, we're not putting our stockpile back, and then we're continuing to send aid to the Ukrainians. I don't know how sustainable that is over time, but one of the things I think the Biden administration really should have done from the outset. I'm okay with depleting stockpiles in the short term, but we need to be cognizant that these stockpiles need to be replaced. And as energy costs increased, as there's, it costs, and also obtaining the resources to make these weapon systems, the cost of everything, inflation, it's getting more and more expensive to do this. I think this is why the administration isn't pushing or isn't making a push to ramp up production in order, because again, we have to ramp up production not only to restock ourselves, but for future allotments to the Ukrainians. This is why I worry about this issue. Again, like I'm with you. Foreseeable future, several months. Yeah, we could do this, but this isn't sustainable.
Yeah, I think that's why in the past couple of packages, you've seen very large packages, but they're largely stuff that's medium to long term. So contracts with industry rather than more presidential drawdowns. I think probably for that very reason, understanding that Ukraine's needs won't stop when the last bullet is fired. They're going to need to be able to rebuild and continue taking an inventory because Putin's probably not done with with Ukraine. Even if this war does come to an end. Fortunately, I think for Ukraine, Russia's stocks of artillery shells were probably a little bit smaller than we thought going in the war. They're still very large, but they're not infinite. So Russia will have its own issues to think about. I'm sure the listeners have seen reports about Russia approaching North Korea, some Central Asian countries, at least according to Ukrainian military intelligence for artillery and rocket artillery. Russia has a lot of armor in storage, but again, none of this is infinite. So Ukraine doesn't have to last forever. I guess would be my point. If they can hold out 6 months, a year, I think they'll be okay.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. One thing the Russians do, or they're an exporter of ammunition. I'm an avid shooter, so I could still buy Russian-made ammunition. If they're producing it for export, I suspect they're not going to have, particularly with things like artillery shells, they'll be able to resupply themselves. Based on the impression I get, I do think the Russian defense industrial base is working overtime, but no one can produce 4 million shells in a year, right? So, anyways, and they might have some problems with particular inputs like chemicals, or there might be particular classes of like certain 122 millimeter rocket or artillery munitions that they're short on or can't produce for whatever reason. So I think a lot of the talk of general crisis in the Russian defense industrial base is probably overblown, at least in the very near term, because they do have stocks of
of certain inputs they can use to continue production. But Russia, none of this is infinite, and Russia can't last forever in a war of attrition either.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I'm going to turn back to the U.S. production side. And you had mentioned that a lot of these they're producing contracts for manufacture, but we're not increasing our manufacturing capability. That's a big concern of mine, right? So are the Ukrainians actually getting these weapons, these munitions in a timely fashion if we're putting it out for contract and we know that there's a very long lead time in the production? And another concern of mine is, what if there is a shooting war and the U.S. does get involved in, say, Taiwan? We've depleted our stockpiles. We're not increasing our capacity. Now, that's an issue far beyond Ukraine. That's more of a U.S. defense issue, outside of Europe, right? But these are the things that I worry about, that it seems like in a certain way we're trying to supply the Ukrainians on the cheap here. I don't think that's, it's sustainable for, as you said, next 6 months. But beyond that, if this really is something that needs to be evaluated by the U.S. government and by the Department of Defense.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Bill.
The last point we're going to talk here about in the bigger picture, the issue of the Europe's energy shortfalls and how this may impact support. I concur with you. The Kharkov offensive certainly is going to buoy up European support. But it also can push Putin to go all in on on him using energy as a weapon. And let's face it, the U.S. has been using sanctions. U.S. and Europe has been using sanctions and using its form of or trying to use its form of energy weapon. And Putin and Russia is certainly countering with that. I would expect the Russians to do that. How do you think, what happens? Does this situation change dramatically if it's a harsh winter and the Europeans have to start rationing? I realize this is a little bit out of the military picture, but this is something that is certainly of concern. Do European countries start pushing Ukraine for a settlement? Is U.S. support enough for the Ukrainians?
So it's just first, I've often caveat that I'm not an energy expert. However, just based on what I understand from talking to folks who are, I think this will not be the worst one. It'll be the next one when they've sort of exhausted the storage and then Russia really sort of has them over a barrel. But it'd be very tough for me to see the Europeans walking back from their commitments, at least in a very dramatic way. If the French could put some quiet pressure on Kyiv to stop the war, frankly, I think Kyiv would respond, stick it where the sun don't shine. I don't think Macron is going to be able to leverage Zelensky very much. And European, like I said before, European support is important, but again, it's U.S. support that's really the key one. And I don't see that going away because of Putin's energy war.
Yeah, I definitely think what we just witnessed over the last week is going to buoy up the efforts to support Ukraine through the winter. I think it's going to be a hard winter for the Europeans. They're already talking about rationing. Energy costs are high. I think that protest we saw in Prague was quite significant. Certainly all things to keep an eye on. Again, John, thank you so much for joining us. And I look forward to our next report on this. It's great to have you.
Great to talk to you, Bill.
All right. Thanks again, John. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you could find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one. Thanks again, and we'll see you all again soon.